I think it's changed over time. So it's a yes and no answer in the sense that whenever a political movement is a social movement is contesting its ideas and trying to change the meaning of words or asking for more justice, then the mainstream media has to take acknowledgement of it. And that leads to discussions about journalism itself in the press. Because part of the, for example, if you look at the George Floyd, uh, I mean, time itself, summer of 2020, at that time there was a lot of media criticism on how American mainstream media actually covered the Black experience. So so there are moments when there is substantial reflection and it feels like journalism itself is going to change and become more inclusive. But there's also a sense of a regression where right after those moments are gone and a substantial discourse may have actually taken place, there's a tendency for the old guard to just come back and do reporting the way it's done, which is go to a lot of expert sources, go to just the mainline community, and not pay attention to much of the criticism that happened, or just staff up for diversity, but not actually go beyond staffing up. So there's a journey that mainstream media is going through. But overall, if you compare with 20 years ago and you compare with 50 years ago, the 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 executive suites of the mainstream media companies are significantly more aware of what the challenge to journalistic culture actually is. But different executives are taking different types of bets depending upon the politics of the country. Like, for example, CNN, if you look at what happened after the new owners took over, they are placing a bet on what I would call as conventional centrism. They're literally saying, calling out people as liars and so on is no longer going to work. And that's the signal you're getting. So that's an example of what I would call a doubling down on the old approach. But not everybody is doing that. So the short answer to your question is different mainstream entities are taking different calls, but there's definitely no more of a denial that our journalism is somehow objective and what we report is the only way reporting is done. And all the other people are advocacy journalists, and we control the mass media, so we will do what we have to do. There's two ways to approach that question. One is tactically on the ground, like everyday storytelling and all of the implications that happen there with decision making in the newsroom, reporters pitching to editors, and editors approving pitches or killing stories even before they are done, and so forth. And there's also a strategic way, which is discuss the question of newsworthiness and the role PR plays in helping journalists determine what is news, and discuss the word controversies on how controversies become a way to let PR have a seat at the table to make something that isn't a dispute look like a dispute, or to make something that's actually disputed not look like a dispute, whichever way it is. So one of the challenges I find is that the only reason greenwashing may actually happen is because the sourcing paradigm of reporters is such that it's already elite leaning. It leans towards the elites. So PR folks may produce somebody as an expert who has a view, she or he, and that it might look like that expert is disputing the views of other settled experts. And then because something looks like a dispute, it then looks like, oh, it's controversial, so let's publish, because controversies generate clicks, generate views, and so forth. So this idea of turning controversy as a way to sell news is itself problematic, just ethically. If the sourcing paradigm instead was about actually vetting the sources after you understand the issue, like, is this a settled issue? So if you just take climate change as an example, is it settled by the weight of empirical evidence or not? If it's settled by the weight of empirical, experts, then if there's no real dispute, then what are we sourcing from people who are saying it's a dispute for isn't clear. In which case, if the entities behind that kind of sourcing are PR entities, then you've got to stop right there and ask, why are we even talking to them? On the other hand, PR entities do play a role in communicating to reporters about the latest innovations, about the latest entrepreneurs, what they're doing. Maybe there is a robot that can perform a particular type of surgery in a hospital that maybe a human doctor can only supervise because it may be super precise. And that is something they feel reporters are not picking up on. So it isn't like all PR is bad, but I feel the role of PR, if at all, was primarily to elevate knowledge in reporters about the latest developments and positions people are taking. But the responsibility of determining whether something is an issue, whether something is a controversy, and how that has to be sourced, what your diversity of sourcing is, depends on what type of issue this is. That responsibility lies with the reporter, and the truth determination function of the reporter goes off track if you're only going to lean on experts, because reporters have knowledge of community, they have knowledge of solutions that are being done locally. They can speak to people on the ground to get a sense for what is the implication of this kind of position that this company takes, and then they get a much better idea of multiple realities, and then they can determine what the story really needs to be. What usually happens, though, if you go away from the strategic space into the tactical space, is one, I have a deadline, I have to do a story. Two, I have to determine whether this is breaking news or this is an investigative piece or an enterprise piece. Now, in an enterprise piece and investigative pieces, you usually have some time to figure out the sourcing and how to frame it and what quotes are, what has to be fact checked and so forth. In breaking news, usually you don't have time. So that's where the biggest problems come. Chevron might go out and say something that we have this new technology, we're converting, methane to biomethane, and so we've contributed to lower carbon. And simply relaying the statements made by a company as part of news, that's where you start getting into greenwashing. Because breaking news, by and large, from what we have seen in my work, is the weakest form of journalism when it comes to ethical gatekeeping. Investigative news has a higher moral center, so you tend to be far more rigorous in examining claims. But breaking news is the weakest in the examination of claims. The claims are considered newsworthy just because they're being made by CEOs or politicians. So that's why. That's why tactically environmental reporting and breaking news have to be done super carefully. Yeah, so I think that's part of the elite problem in journalism, that there's an assumption that if somebody is with an NGO and has title and is advocating for a cause, and they're an NGO and they're known in the area of uh, human rights and so on, that they cannot be wrong, or it's worth carrying their views anyway without validating them or vetting them or pushing back and asking them to explain how they arrived at the views, what actual evidence they have. So there is the tendency, and that's partly because reporters tend to have a Rolodex of experts, and they have relationships with these experts, and there's a tendency to say, okay, I'll just get these quotes from all these people. This is already a disputed issue. I don't have to resolve it in the story because I'm a journalist. I'm just going to run the dispute as it is, and then just let it ride and think that somehow it contributes to the discourse. But really, discourse only happens if you are vetting claims made by people, asking them whether they are justifiable claims. If so, how did they come to this evidence? So the example you're giving about Greenpeace and Shell, this happens all over the world. So even in India, during the heights of the transgenic cotton controversy about BT cotton that Monsanto was actually introducing, the environmental movement in India that was NGO led was not being transparent about the fact that the farmers in India had taken Monsanto BT cotton seeds, which were only 3 varieties at that time, and India had 240 or so cotton varieties, because the agroecological variation in India is so high, 3 varieties of cotton seeds are just not going to work. So Indian farmers know for what soil, for what weather, what cotton seeds are going to work. They actually hybridized illegally, quote in quotes, illegally in quotes, they actually hybridized their versions of cotton with Monsanto BT cotton, and they found that it actually works better. It adapts to the local conditions, and they had relatively successful crops compared to those farmers whose BT seeds had failed, and some of those farmers started committing suicides. While reporting these stories, the views of the NGOs were almost always against transgenics per se. They were like, no, transgenics is anti-environment. You've got to have buffer zones. In India, it's hard to put buffer zones. They were all legitimate arguments, but important facts would not come out if you listen only to one side that you've already credited being the pro-social justice side or the pro-environmental side. And the companies are reluctant to admit that their seeds have been actually hybridized in this fashion, because then it means that they've got to do something about it. So it's a fairly complicated issue. So yes, so the usual remedy for that is to not be talking only to the elites, but to talk to people on the ground. And so then you get a sense of multiple layers of reality. You've got the elite realities where there's a contest going on between different types of power on an issue that has to do with policy. But you've got what people, everyday people on the ground have to do. Everyday people on the ground, like actual consumers and farmers, have to take decisions involving their lives. And they take decisions that may not even be understood by journalists unless you go and speak to them. So yes, so yeah, I'm fairly confident there will be more examples of that. So that's why I feel that there's a deeper reason for why they say diversify sourcing, because what they mean is you are diversifying sourcing not just to bring diversity of perspective where the facts aren't disputed. You are diversifying because you want to interrogate multiple realities. There is no such thing as one reality out there. There are people journeying through life who are stakeholders on the issue, and they have to take decisions. And unless you speak to people without judging the issue upfront or judging even the newsworthiness of the issue upfront, it's hard to actually take the call. I have one more comment on all sidesism, but I can come back to it after your next question. I think there's one substantial misconception about journalism that news companies are propagating that is causing some of this problem systematically, and that has to do with volume. The assumption is higher volume, higher production of stories is somehow productivity, because it gets more audiences, it gets more eyeballs. So the entire attention economy of online distribution predicates an approach that we have to do more stories, more unique stories every day, just differentiated enough in the quotes, in who's saying what to whom, and that somehow is news. And if you look at the other side of that coin for where this is actually going, because only some newsrooms have the resources to do breaking news all the time, and those are the big newsrooms. If you look at the smaller newsrooms, the opportunity is the opposite. Because of how the internet is structured, it allows digital specialization like nothing else. So you have the chance for newsrooms to say, we're going to do one thing, and we're going to do it so well that nobody else can do it as well as us. So in the US, you've got criminal justice as a topic, you've got guns as a topic, and you've got environmental issues itself. And there are a whole bunch of boutique organizations that are devoting journalistic apparatus to that topic and all of the associated issues around it, if you will. Then it's possible to determine what volume are we going to publish, how are we going to get our audience, how do we rely on social media, which is like a necessary evil. You need social media for your distribution, but then unless you have outrage in your headlines, it doesn't seem to go as fast as not. So, but all of those calculations become easier if you have decided how you specialize and why, as opposed to trying to do everything for a general audience around. So that, I'm not saying everybody must be specialized. All I'm saying is the assumption that higher volume is what the public wants is actually a problem, because right now there's too much news on everybody's news feeds. And you are trying to figure out which news article you're going to click, and your brain doesn't have the cognitive decision-making capacity for every article I'm going to click if I'm going to decide whether that article is from a legacy newsroom, whether it's from a responsible newsroom, whether it's a topic I actually care about. These are just, if I was reading only 2 news articles a day, then I would be able to do that. But I'm not reading 2 news articles a day. I'm probably browsing maybe a few hundred headlines a day, or maybe at least for people who avoid the news, because there is news avoidance is a real thing because it causes anxiety. There's too much conflict in it. There's a lot of those issues at the everyday consumer level that volume is not helping. So I would start there about how lesser resources can be used to still do the news. At the same time, I would not completely give up on breaking news itself, because when you devote time to resources to a niche area, you tend to do breaking news in that area that's more original to all the sourcing you've done. Then the public gets to know that you put a story out that nobody else did, and then the bigger news outlets can carry that story. That's already happening. There's an indirect syndication industry that's built up over time, where the big press tends to see that boutique news organizations are actually doing better at this, and then they pick up the story and run. So I feel there's not enough of an exploration of networks of news between people who specialize, have lesser resources, and people who are bigger and have more distribution muscle, and link those up. This is a good question. I think both aspects are structurally missing in a lot of newsrooms. Today, but particular organizations have already advanced the practice in a way that helps me highlight 2 things. One is separate the engagement process with the community from the reporter's responsibility within the story. So a lot of times, once a story pitch is approved, then the reporter is trying to get sourcing, and then has a bunch of existing sources because of the lead, because of how the lead came in or how it got triggered and so on. And then they have to go find other sources to either dispute what the source says or disagree or add insights or add lived experience. But all of the responsibility of using engagement to make the story more comprehensive by bringing new sources in becomes predicated within the deadline that the reporter has for the story, and that almost never works. If the community engagement process that's running in the newsroom is actually separated out, which is happening these days more, but it's not happening on a widespread basis, given to a community engagement editor whose only job, or more people like that, whose only job is to have ongoing conversations with the audience on various issues that they want to weigh in on, whether it's climate change, whether it's solutions to climate change, whether it's incarceration, or whether it's reform of bail reforms that are used oftentimes to hold people in prison for much longer than they have. Whatever be the topics, usually the public can weigh in whether or not a story is predicated on the line. If those loops are separated, then when the reporters really want community input, they'll be able to get it faster than if they're trying to ask for it in the story's deadline. Some newsrooms are doing this better. For example, KPCC, which is a public media organization in Los Angeles, has a community engagement cadence that runs on its own, and then uses that to work with the reporting team. That kind of approach helps. Now, if you go to specialists, I think what happens is it is not possible to expect somebody who's come out of journalism school, who's 22, 23, 24, 25, who has not fully embraced the complexities of public policy on any one topic. Let's take criminal justice, let's take immigration, let's take climate change. You take any issue on which the substantial public policy history, exactly what you were saying earlier, there's no memory of what happened before and how the old problems are coming back. It's not possible to get a young general assignment reporter to suddenly come up to speed with A, history, and B, lack of memory of that history, and see all of the lack of disclosures and the dishonesty that companies may or may not have actually engaged in, or maybe criminal justice institutions may or may not have engaged in within their city, their county, their prison system, and so on. So by definition, this is something that's built up over time as knowledge, as beat expertise for the reporter, but the number of reporters doing that are going down. So it does help to have a specialist, but the way it works better is to have specialists available in the newsroom at large so that their capacity is tapped across the board. So for example, if you're a large news organization with, let's say, 100 local newspapers like Gannett, the assumption is you would have a bunch of experts in areas that have to do with these, that who are available to reporters for internal vetting. If they get a claim, they run the claim not just by their own fact-checking ability, but they send it to an expert within the newsroom saying, you are the consulting editor for, let's say, criminal justice. Can you tell us what's missing in this? There's something odd about it, or what additional insight should be used, or what questions should I ask? That kind of consultative work, if that happens like literally on the go, then you are having specialists, but you're not dedicating too many specialists, and you're also sharing resources across the network. I feel those approaches need to be used pretty much all the time so that you can best leverage specialist talent, simply because complexity is writ large everywhere in just the world we live in.